few weeks ago, I got an email from Mark Johnson asking about this chord progression here that I'm playing right now. The progression from Something by the Beatles. And it was these first 4 chords of the progression that he was most interested in, where we start on C major, and then we get C major 7, and then C dominant 7, or what you could just call C7, and then F. And it has this really satisfying sort of stepping down sound, where we move just one semitone down with the top note of each chord. Now, one of the things that Mark was asking about this chord progression is there any other songs that use this progression? And there certainly is.
Raindrops keep falling on my head, and just like the guy whose feet are too big for his bed. If you think that all is lost,
that I'm not easy to hold. It's so sad.
Sin your face, you're ready to blame the first guy in line to catch the train.
A song that I'm pretty sure was directly inspired by the chord progression in Something is the song Something More by the band Train, because then not only do they use the same chord progression in the exact same key, but the song in general has a very Beatles sound to it. George Harrison himself, who of course wrote Something by the Beatles, also has used this chord progression again, most notably in Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, but in this example he adds a dominant 7 to the 4 chord. A song that gets a lot of mileage out of this chord progression is Kiss Me by Sixpence None the Richer. And the reason I say it gets a lot of mileage out of it is that it keeps teasing us. So rather than going to the 4 chord, at first all it does is comes down, it starts on the tonic chord of E flat major 7, E flat 7, and then rather than giving us the satisfaction of going to A flat, it climbs back up again. So it gets E flat major 7, E flat 7, E flat major 7. And then eventually later on it does give us the reward of the 4 chord just before we go into the chorus.
Kiss me out of the bed and barley night lane beside the green, green grass. Swing, swing, swing the spinning step. You wear those shoes and I wear that dress on.
So of course in Something by the Beatles, although we get this chord progression to start with in the first section, after the F, it doesn't just loop again, it then goes somewhere else. We go to D, and then we go to G. So different songs will have a different way of moving on from that initial descending line. And another really common thing to do is once you hit the 4 chord, F, is to then go to F minor. That lovely melancholic sound, and then quite possibly resolve back to the 1 chord and then go somewhere else. It's a really common way to extend that descending line, because if we look at the notes in the chords here, C major and C major 7, so that top note comes down by a semitone, C7, top note once again is coming down by a semitone, then F, we've come down once again by a semitone, and then by going to F minor, we continue that semitone run. And then by going to C major, the tonic chord, we have also extended that semitone run. So it's this really satisfying chromatic line at the top of the chord progression.
So many things you took hard to keep the love alive. But baby, it ain't over till it's over. You're just too good to be true. Can't take my eyes off of you. You'd be like heaven to touch. I wanna hold you so much. At last love has arrived, and I thank God I'm alive. We are a rock revolving around a golden sun. We are a billion children rolled into one. So when I hear about a hole in the sky, they sat together in the park as the evening sky grew dark. She looked at him and he felt a spark tingle to his bones. 'Twas then he felt alone and wished, if a picture paints 1,000 words, then why can't I paint you? The words will never show. Ever since I was a kid at school, I messed around with all the rules. Apologized, then realized.
So let's take a closer look now at why this chord progression works the way it does, why it sounds so satisfying. Of course, as we do with many chord progressions, this chord progression starts on the tonic chord, on the 1 chord. So C major in the key of C. Then we move to C major 7. Now C major 7 is the diatonic 7 chord we can have on the tonic chord. So in the key of C major, for example, if we want to add a 7th degree to the tonic chord, it's naturally going to be the major 7. So that's not particularly unusual. All it does is it adds a bit of colour and a slight bit of tension to the tonic chord. But then the interesting bit is then when we get the C dominant 7, or what we can just call C7, this chord is of course not technically in the key because we've got this B flat now. We're in the key of C major, so we shouldn't have a black note. But what's going on here is this is a secondary dominant chord. It is the 5 chord of the 4th chord in the key, the 5 of 4. In other words, it's the 5th chord of F major. So we get this sort of temporary kind of key change, but not actually a key change. It's not elaborate enough to be a key change. It's just a brief moment where we point ourselves instead to F rather than C as a sort of point of rest. And that's why it's so satisfying when the C7 chord moves to F, because that tension there wants us to move there. It's the 5 chord, the dominant chord. Dominant chords want to resolve to the chord that's a 5th away. That's what they do. The other thing happening here in this chord progression is what we call a line cliche. And the line cliche is that element where there's that semitone line moving down at the top of the chord progression. So when we say a line cliche, the line we're talking about is that semitone line, that chromatic line that links the chords together. Now, technically speaking, for a line cliche in the purest sense, everything else about the chord has to stay exactly the same apart from the line cliche that's moving. So it's only actually the first 3 chords in this progression which count as a line cliche in the typical sense, because they're all basically a C major chord, but with a line climbing down at the top. And although that semitone line then does continue into the F chord, because another element of the chord down below has changed, the E has moved up to F, it no longer counts as a line cliche in the sort of strictest sense of the word. But this is an example of a line cliche where the progression, the line is at the top of the chord. You could have a line cliche where the line was at the bottom of the chord instead. And in fact, we could use this exact same chord progression to do that. So if instead the C, B and B flat that move down at the top move down at the bottom, we still have the same chords, but we would now have a line cliche at the bottom instead. As you can hear, it takes on a different quality. We've basically inverted it, but it's the same essential chord progression. It functions in the same way. Now, an interesting thing about Something is Paul McCartney's bass playing. Something is widely regarded as one of Paul McCartney's greatest and most creative bass lines in a Beatles song. And it's an incredibly melodic and exploratory bass line. It keeps moving around. It doesn't necessarily play the tonic note of the chord. So what that actually means is that if we're talking strictly about the inversions here, it means that the major 7 chord, the second chord in the progression, is actually a second inversion chord because Paul McCartney moves up to the G at that point. And then he moves back down to C for the C7. So technically, the second chord in the progression in Something is a second inversion. It's C major 7 over G. So that is the Something chord progression. If you can think of any other songs that use this progression, then do leave them in the comments down below. And if you can think of another interesting chord progression that you think could make for a good video like this, then do suggest that as well, because I think it's often you guys that come up with the best ideas for these videos.